All right, let's come to attention. We have a lovely presentation today about the German Democratic Republic, Orlo Chapter 10. Okay, go right ahead.
Okay, so Orlo Chapter 10 was about the German Democratic Republic, which is also known as the GDR, so I'm going to keep calling it that. So that's what that stands for. And
GDR, which can also be called the DDR, the Deutsch Democratic
Republic. So this was East Germany after Hitler.
East Germany after Hitler.
So after Hitler ruled, East Germany started to kind of break off from West Germany, and they wanted to start a socialist communist regime. And in their hearts, they believed that East Germany was always separate from West Germany. And one of them was like the democratic bourgeoisie, and the other was the proletariat, and that the proletariat had to rise and create their own communist regime in their own separate nation. And while the leaders felt this way, the people weren't super convinced. And my PowerPoint's a little cut off, so I don't know what that says. But so they promoted democracy, but it was a very drab place, and it was very authoritarian in rule. So it is still cut off? No, it's not. So democracy in the GDR, it often used terms to sound democratic, but there was no aspects of democracy whatsoever. This is a quote that I found in the book. It said, "Everything has to look democratic, but we have to be in control of everything," which was a secretary of the governing party, someone who was pretty high up. And so they established a constitution to promote the facade of democracy, but they actually had 4 constitutions in the 50-so years that they reigned, because they just could never provide a stable basis for their society. So at the start, the nation still had elements of the capitalist structure, keeping it a step behind the Soviet Union, but they were very influenced by the Soviets and continually strived for that. So the leading party in this nation was the Socialist United Party, which was the SED, because in German I have no idea what it is, but it's SED shortened. So their ultimate goal was to create socialism on German soil, and they were like highly affiliated with the Communist Party, and it gave them a lot of power in this nation. So they had a stronghold on the Congress and the Central Committee, and they were able to make it so the Congress really didn't have any say or like aspects of democracy. There was no free debate or like democratic decision making. It was all the SED controlling everything. So these were other important organizations. There was the East German Secret Police, the labor unions, the youth organization, the German Women's Association, and the Association for German-Soviet Friendship, but all of these groups were influenced by the SED, so all of these were working towards socialism and communism and just influencing society in that way. So freedoms in the GDR, which there weren't many, everything was tightly censored. Everything that was published or promoted on the radio, where everything was to enforce the party, kind of how it was in the Soviet Union. It was all propaganda. And they promoted industrialism to hide the economic planning and production that they were using to centralize the control. So they're saying like, oh, we're growing industry and you have this great economy, but it was really all just a centralized communist economic government. So they were labor unions, but it didn't really do anything because there was unreal production expectations, and they had long work days, and they still had like the same food rations as they were getting before the work days had become so long. So they really didn't have the time or the energy to do anything in their labor unions, and they really had no say or no power in what they were doing. So the economy, as kind of mentioned before, it was very centralized, and it was just bad the whole time. There was centralization. It always reduces individual initiative and responsibility. We learned about it in colonial history, and it just shows throughout history. It's just when you make everything centralized, people are less willing to work. But if you give people a responsibility and a role over what they're making, they're going to work more. So, but the socialists didn't realize this. They wanted to make everything equal and everything communal. So privately owned companies became a minority. 90% of the farmers worked on agricultural production cooperatives by 1963. And it was just all for industrialization. So even with all this, the GDR faced economic stagnation due to lack of resources, and their industrialization was really like towards military and like big machinery, but nothing was really towards consumer goods. So there was like a flux in the economy because people didn't have things to buy. When Stalin died, since the GDR was very influenced by the Soviet Union, the new leadership sent some messages to the GDR, and things started to change a little bit. There was some appeasement to the masses, and some of the pressure economically was released. There was an increase in consumer goods, and the industrialization kind of slowed down for a period, and it kind of made people want to come back to East Germany just a little bit. They were still not pleased with what was going on, and there were some demonstrations. There was a revolt happening in June of 1953, but it was put down in the end, and the communists stayed in control. So with Berlin, I think we all know about the Berlin Wall. But once the GDR realized it could not influence the rest of the world, they decided to stop being influenced by the rest of the world. So they closed themselves off from Germany in the West, and after discussing it with the big powers of the world, they decided that they were going to cut off connection between East and West Berlin, and they started the wall in August of 1963. And while this really upset the western side of the world, they really took no concrete measures. It wasn't a huge threat to them, so they just let it be. And the Berlin Wall was built. Yeah. So when the 1960s came, it was the Berlin Wall. There was a General Secretary, Walter Ulbricht, who rose to power in East Germany, and the 1960s was like his decade. He was really hated at the start of his career, but he was so powerful. So at this time was also the time when the GDR took its big steps into socialism, taking on more nationalism, more communal roles in the economy, and like the SED was growing, and as the SED grew, so did Ulbricht's popularity, and by the end of the decade, he really believed that the GDR had gotten on the level of the Soviet Union. And with that, the communists were just like so high in power, and the smaller interest groups had kind of faded out from the scene. So continuing on, East Germany had a living standard that was 40% lower than that of West Germany. So even though they thought the reforms they were making in the economy were working, it really wasn't. Life was still kind of hard for them. And over 90% of the economy had been centralized, and they had given managers more say to make managers more willing to work. So they're like, oh, you can make the decisions in your business, you can, like, it's your business, but they were still hiding that collectivist policy that they had. So they created the system of the new economic system, which that kind of just like regulated the economy more and increased the standard of living, but they continued to struggle. There was really no good time of the economy in this nation. And since they were so closed off from the rest of the world, East Germany, they really had no like capital investment from other nations. They weren't building off other nations to stabilize their economy, and that really hurt them. And their agricultural production and other production of goods were just, it was so much lower than they had wanted it to be. So the NES became the ESS. The NES was the new economic system, and this happened in April of 1967. The NES had tried to modernize all aspects of the economy, and when they realized that wasn't working, they switched to the economic system of socialism, the ESS, to better prioritize. So this wasn't focusing on all of the economy, it was different concepts of the economy that they could focus on first and build the economy that way. So they really put an emphasis on sectors that would make them like a real player in the international markets. So culture at this time, with the censorship of the press, there was also artists, educators, writers. They all had the task to push socialist mentality in their work. Educators had to teach socialist ideas. Artists had to paint. The form at the time was the socialist realism, just to exhibit the party. And then writers had to write propaganda and write all about the goodness that was happening in their nation. Even under this regime, there were still people, as there always is, who stood out in the society to write against it, and those things wouldn't be published in East Germany, but those works were very important to the West to see what was happening. So on the left, there's a socialist realism, and my PowerPoint got a little messed up, so all those words should be over there. But that's Joseph Stalin with flowers and children, and he looks really happy, and he looks really like great, and it's just like kind of idolizing the man. And then on the right, this was a book that someone wrote, and it was saying like, East Germany is terrible, and it was a story about a collectivist farmer who really had no prosperity in his life, and showing the ways that the economy was really failing. So Erich Honecker, I think is how you say it? Honecker was the leader from 1971 to 1989, so basically up until the end of the GDR's rule. And he came from a very leftist family. He had these influences in his life for his whole life. And his main goal was just to maintain the Communist Party in the GDR because they really had the monopoly on political power. So he wrote a new constitution. It was one of the 4 written during these 50 years. And it was all just to safeguard the communist control. He worked hard to raise the standard of living, but kept the central planning, and those two things don't really go together. So they achieved some gains, but there was no substantial gains that would stay. So with that, the economies in the 1970s, this is really when the inflation just kind of hit them hard, and they really realized they needed to step up their game. So this brought them into the production of more consumer goods, basic consumer goods, rather than cars and military vehicles. They were making things like clothes and other consumer goods. And they started to lean on Western banks for help with their economy. They released political prisoners for compensation, bettered trade relations with West Germany, and liberalized West German travel into East Germany in 1972. And obviously it was still very hard to get through. You needed certain paperwork. You had to pay a certain amount per day to be in East Germany, but that helped the government and started to make the reform of tearing down the wall. But this helped move the economy forward, but it really, in the end, just made them dependent on the West for the rest of the time with their economy. They really could never break away and make their true socialist economy. So this is all kind of when the end starts for the GDR. Toward the end of the 1970s, all the ruling members were super old, and they were starting to really have a hard time maintaining the oligarchy that they had created. It was becoming, this is the time of glasnost and perestroika, and East Germany was just not on board with those things. So as all other communist nations were embracing that, they had kind of stayed as the odd man out and trying to continue their communist regime. And the youth and intellectuals are starting to rise up, and to combat this, censorship increased even against Soviet works, which is strange because they had been looking to the Soviet Union this whole time. But it really just, that kind of split them from the Soviet Union by 1989. So as freedom was beginning to spread in other nations, and the communists were beginning to lessen throughout the world, the GDR just continued to try to move on its communist path, and it continued to not work. So the world began to look for the reunification of East and West Germany, and even though they resisted, their leadership began to crack, and that's really when change started to occur. And the big catalyst was in 1989, there was a large exodus of East Germans over to the West. And authorities just could not grasp the reality of what was happening. They really thought they could continue this communist rule, but they didn't understand that it was really communists had ended, and there was no way they were going to save it at this point. So people began to leave, and they weren't coming back, and demonstrations began all throughout the nation, and the leaders didn't really know what to do at this point. They felt that there was a revolt, but the SED really had no way to deal with it at this point. They were growing much weaker than they were 20 years prior, and finally the SED had made arrangements and agreed with the demonstrators, and this is really the big steps of change. So with the demonstrations, the criticism, and the work with the SED, leadership changed, policies began to be reformed, and the economy began to be decentralized as travel restrictions were being eased, and they were allowing more free market into their society. The Berlin Wall was open, and they opened the press as well, so journalists were able to reveal what the leaders were doing, and they realized the leaders were living at a standard way higher than anyone in East Germany, so this caused the people to arrest most of the old leading members. I don't know what that last point is, I'm going to be honest. They eliminated something. I don't know. So the SED, the powerful party of East Germany, finally collapses in 1989 when almost 500,000 members resigned their loyalty to the party. And in the next future election, they were predicted to get no more than 20%, and they actually got 16% of the popular vote, so they really crumbled from having over 90% to less than 20. So the new party that stepped in was the Alliance for Germany. And it was also in the first free election Germany had experienced in the past 58 years. So the final end of the GDR came much quicker than anyone expected. Once you started the change, everything just kind of spiraled until East and West Germany reunited. So originally they believed that East Germany could become its own nation, its own democratic free state, and not reunify, but they're realizing slowly that they had to just reunify Germany and make it a whole nation. So there was a plan to make a German confederation, but it all moved quicker than they thought, and the falling economy just spurred them into reuniting with the democratic West Germany. So with that they went back into the form that the currency form that West Germany used for money, and that kind of showed that they were coming back into West Germany. And with that, political union followed as the economy lined up with the other. And on August 31st, the two sides signed an agreement for political unity. And the understanding was that the GDR, they wouldn't be a confederation, it would just be Germany, and the GDR would be pulled into the West. So the date for reunification was set for October 3rd, 1990, and now we have a unified Germany. And that's it.
Any questions? Any comments? Any snide remarks? No, we don't want to do those.
Any Snyder remarks?
Oh! You know, this is being recorded. Perhaps I can back it up and remove that.